Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Anastasia Spramuli, and I'm the Director of Graduate Admissions here at Bay Path University. I'm also thrilled to introduce Tasha Allen, and she's an OT graduate assistant in our doctoral candidate on the mental health track student. And then our tonight's hot topic in sensory strategies to prevent maladaptive behaviors in educational settings. And we are honored to have Dr. Audrie Vantangoli as our guest speaker. Dr. Vantangoli is a licensed pediatric OT and founder of Get a Grip on OT, specializing in sensory integration and self-regulation. Throughout the presentation, do feel free to submit any questions via chat on the GoToWebinar. And we will also have time for a Q&A at the end, so I'll be able to read the questions, and Dr. Vantangoli will be able to answer them for you guys. Now, please welcome her and get started on the presentation.
Sure, thank you so much. I just as a precursor to all this, I am going to shut off my video because I'm having a lot of lagging. I did have some power that went out right before this. So I'm going to shut the video off. And by no means did I want to do that. I really like to interact with the audience, but for the sake of the lagging, I think it's best. So today's presentation is on sensory strategies to prevent maladaptive behaviors in the educational setting. This was part of my capstone. I did do a continuing education course that I presented to teachers related to this subject, but it also is a near and dear passion for me as I've worked in several settings that, I've just kind of mastered my skills in these areas, as well as just really have a passion for children that get kind of left behind in some services based on their behaviors that are labeled as maladaptive when I think they stem from other areas. So tonight's course objectives, it's to provide this audience or educators with useful information related to the sensory systems that will support students' participation and reduce those challenging behaviors in the classroom. It's also to help educators, or again, whatever role you may be in the audience here, define the function of behaviors by identifying lagging skills and deficits within the sensory systems. I hope that it'll build some confidence in implementing sensory strategies within the classroom to decrease behaviors. And we really want to reduce stigma around behavioral challenges by supporting those neuro-affirming practices. So again, we find that many children are labeled as behavioral when we find that they're actually related to some lagging skills or some sensory needs. So really, why is this so important? Specifically for educators, this is really important because elementary school educators, they experience the greatest need of behavioral interventions, but often receive the least amount of training. I find that a lot of the educators that I talk to, those behavioral trainings and interventions seem to happen in special needs classrooms, or when there's really a separate classroom or a classroom that has been identified for behavioral needs. What we do know is that 67% of educators say that they've only completed one standalone course in behavioral management. When we look at the special education population, those teachers report about 87% of them have received at least one standalone course. And for me, in my opinion, this is, really an area that teachers deal with all day, every day. So having just one course really is inadequate for their needs. We do also find that most behaviors happen in that K through 12 general education population. So again, a lot of the focus ends up being on those special populations, but really the typical public school teacher faces the majority of the behaviors within the classroom. So when we look at this, these are some kind of oldish statistics, a few years ago, but elementary school educators are threatened or physically attacked at a much higher ratio than their middle school counterparts. So elementary schools, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, where middle school, we're looking more at a 7-to-1 ratio. So as we can see, those needs for those younger grades are really, really popping up. I know I currently work in a private day school, and we're getting a lot more elementary school referrals. So I really do feel like the elementary population is really looking for resources and looking for help in these areas. What we do know is that correlation between behaviors and poor academics, it's been widely explored, and that 56% of classrooms report that the disruptions that happen in class are typically from student behaviors. We also know that classroom experience, so this is the teacher's experience, positively correlates with effective classroom management, meaning teachers that have more experience with teaching typically have better behavioral management skills. And again, that just comes some with experience. And I think when we look and break down teacher education and that pre-service training, there are two different tracks to becoming a teacher. One of those has a lot more in-service time versus another where we would specialize in a different course and then get your teacher certification. You don't have to spend as much classroom time there. So when we look at novice teachers, there's really a difference too in kind of the amount of time that they've had in a classroom and experiencing the children's behaviors. As I'm sure all of us know and kind of can relate to our own specialty, COVID really had an impact on all of this. About 84% of teachers report that COVID negatively impacted students' behaviors. If we look at the Harvard study, it talks about children dropping a half a grade in math and a third of a grade in reading, and that teachers would have to teach at 150% for 3 years in order to make up just for the academic differences. So this does not account for any of those social emotional differences. So depression rates skyrocketed, any of those anxiety-based symptoms, sleep disturbances, any post-traumatic stress or trauma that has come from the COVID time frame. There's been, a lot of mental health changes that have happened with children during this time frame, and it's really impacted the children. And I would also say that, this is not accounting for just those basic social skills that were learned during some years that might have been missed. So being able to sit in a seat, pay attention for longer periods of time, have that structured schedule throughout the day, and not be able just to get up from your computer to go to the bathroom when you needed to, or get something to eat. So there's a lot of changes that have happened too with the children that have experienced COVID. So one thing that I really found in all of my research is that responses across the country really vary. Education looks very different when we start to explore it across the United States. I was really shocked to find that a lot of states still have corporal punishment. So about 17 of them either participate in corporal punishment or do not have a stance against it. So it doesn't necessarily say that they use it, but it doesn't say that they can't use it. So again, this really widely varies from state to state. There have been some states that put some laws into place around recess and not being able to take recess away as part of a punishment. As we know, OTs, I think, are one of the biggest proponents for this active movement and recess. So I think, this is something that we all appreciate, but hopefully more and more states are following suit. I want to say it's California and New Jersey, which have some pretty strong recess laws right now. But this just kind of helps get children moving, as we know. Other research looks at the length of recess. Typically, if we have a 30-minute recess, kids are at their peak and height of energy after that 30 minutes. And there's been some research around the fact that an hour-long recess would allow kids to come back down from that peak. But trying to advocate for an hour-long recess in any public school, I think we'd be met with a lot of resistance to that. So it's probably really familiar to us that when we talk about behavior, we look at the function of behavior. And if any of us have looked at an FBA, it usually talks about escape, attention, or access to the tangibles. It really kind of focuses on the behavior in the moment and kind of what the child is seeking. But my stance on this is, but why? Can we dig a little deeper? We know the child wants to escape the demand. They don't want to do the math work, but why? Is it hard for them? Is it based on their vision? Is it based on their attention span? So my research really looked to expand that a little more and see if there's a deeper function of behavior. So this is probably a really familiar metaphor for everyone, but we talk about the kind of the iceberg, and what we can see of that iceberg is the behavior. So we see the child tantruming or throwing chairs, screaming, swearing, physical aggression, kind of all of the long list of behaviors we could see in a classroom. But what are those underlying factors? Did the child get enough sleep last night? Were they fed? Did they have some sensory concerns? Are they worried about where they're going to go home, where they're going to sleep that night, what parent they're going to go see? There's so many different underlying factors that I think, it's hard for us to always know that function of behavior. So we have to be detectives and look a little deeper in why children are behaving like they are in the classroom. So I love this statement here, to take a minute to respond rather than react to behavior. So, rather than responding with just as heightened of a response or punitive punishment, if we just take a second and kind of find out what the child needs, I think we get a much different response. And it allows us to have some teachable moments. We can create adaptive responses, especially if we're looking at the sensory component. We want to work through whatever stressor is going on, so that we can have a successful moment and kind of continue with that neuroplasticity of the brain and creating those successful moments. And we also want to teach them skill building. And I think all of us could relate that skill building does not happen when we are highly escalated. So some of the research that we found related to sensory processing and its impact on behavior is that school-age children, those that have elevated sensory responsivity, had a higher rate of internalizing, externalizing, or dysregulation. So, in kind of layman's terms here, children with elevated sensory responsivity have behaviors at a higher rate. They have difficulty accessing and participating in the environment. And of course, this results in behaviors within the classroom, at home, whatever kind of situation that we're looking at. So if we're thinking about kind of that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, we see that lack of engagement or participation. We find that avoidance of demands. So again, if we go back to the escape model from that FBA, we might see explosive behavior. So that fight model, or little less known kind of is that fawn model, which is kind of that loss of self, that we kind of look a lot more of a depressive symptoms and lack of engagement and participation. And also that we tend to want to please everyone, right? So we will agree to things that we're really not comfortable with because we're agreeing with them. So I'm going to skip over kind of the what else questions and things like that, just because this is a fairly long presentation and I have, limited amount of time. So I want to get through this fairly quickly, but I want to make sure that everyone understands the information as well. So the one thing we know is that as educators, we also need things that typically the children that we work with need as well. So we need support. And this is just one example of kind of how we can look at what level of support we need. It's an eco-map. And, looking at this and kind of finding where we have some strengths and weaknesses in our lives. Maybe, we have a really good connection to our neighborhood. Maybe we have some really close friends and relatives that we work with, but maybe our medical health or our kids or our responsibilities, are difficult for us at that time. This gives us a little bit of an idea on where we fall on that continuum and where we can build up some of that support. So if we know that we have a really strong support system in friends and relatives, maybe we're not seeking more friends and relatives, but maybe we're focusing more on our health and making that more of a priority. So I do like the eco map for some people that, they like to see this visually, and build some goals and find some priorities around that. Obviously, educators also need resources and training. And as we know from the previous statistics, they don't receive a lot of training related to behavior. Both behavior, that like classroom management and understanding behavior, like all of those kind of elements are just really not covered in that educational core classes for the pre-service training. And we also may need to change our mindset, depending on kind of the culture we're in, or maybe the experience we've had, or some of our own parenting skills. We may need to change how we respond to behaviors. and it may not be the same as we respond to our behaviors of the children at home. So, a lot of times we fall into that parental guidance of children in that professional role as well. And really, some of those are not appropriate. Some of them have poor boundaries. But again, like, it just may totally change what we think is appropriate in school. And I find this a lot when we look at what is kind of reinforcing, which is compared to what our coworkers also find that, like, a child is not getting enough, say, punishment, if you will, for the behavior that's happening. And what we know is that we really fall into that punitive mindset when we're in the schools. That's kind of the culture of public schools. So what I will challenge everyone is to think about behaviors and think that they all stem from these three ideas. So that they're either lagging skills, unmet needs, or stressors. So lagging skills may be that they have poor social skills, or they may have poor math skills. It may be an academic um, skill that they need help with. They may have unmet needs. So even thinking of those basic needs of food and shelter, and they may not get attention that they need at home, so they seek it in really maladaptive ways. And in addition to that, the stressors, and those stressors can be anything from stressors in the environment, like sensory concerns, stressors of not knowing again where they're going home at night, dealing with a fight they may have had with their parents or their siblings. So there's many different categories that the things that our children are facing fall into within these categories. So why is this so important? I feel that if we think about behaviors in those three categories, then we can really come up with something that's solution based, right? If we know that a skill is a deficit, we can work specifically on that skill. It really helps even with IEP goals and thinking about in the school-based setting of if there is a skill deficit related to behaviors, then we can work on that skill as an IEP goal and really try to tackle those behaviors. And we do it in a way that reduces stigma. It really reduces, kind of the labels that are put on these children. And then it'll increase the students' participation, their confidence. They'll definitely learn new skills, and it'll have a better relationship between that adult and that student. So it's really important for us, I believe, to think of behaviors in those three categories. So as we know and think about the brain, the brain develops from bottom up. If we're, thinking about kind of that brain stem, that's really that survival mode versus that limbic system, which is more of our emotion and kind of do I belong, do I fit in, self-doubt, all of that falling really in that limbic system. And then the learning, which happens in the cortex. So that's the bumpy part of our brain. And again, I'm not going to go into all the neuroscience behind this, but we know that it doesn't develop until the late 20s, early 30s. So we are already working with a child that may have underdeveloped skills just because of their age. On top of that, trauma or any other learning disability or medical condition that they may have involved in that. So we're really, looking at this from a science point of view and kind of looking at where we can develop these skills. So really what I love about kind of this hand model here, that if we take our hand and we hold it up and think about our wrist as being our survival mode, our spinal cord, our brain stem. If we bring our thumb across our hand, and I apologize, I don't have the camera on, so I can't show you, but hopefully this visual is helping. The thumb across your hand is that limbic system. And then the fingers, when you close them into a fist, that's all your cortex, the bumpy part, the learning part. When we think about a child, I like to think about this hand model. And in that first picture where the fingers are raised, I would say the child's lid is flipped, meaning they're in a state of dysregulation. And because that cortex is not available, it's in the up position, the children are not able to access any of those higher level skills, those academic skills, those planning skills. So we really, for the sake of sensory, want to get them regulated back online. So we want them to be in that fist mode, having our bumpy section down. And I like to use this with educators to kind of help them understand where the child's at, because we tend to want to be social creatures. We want to kind of engage in conversation, and sometimes it's more of a power struggle. And I do like to explain to educators that when our lid is flipped, when our fingers are up here, the child is not understanding this. They're not understanding consequences. They're not really rational at that point. We need to regulate them, and then we can talk about what boundaries are set up or what expectations are moving forward. Um, all brains are unique. We know that. That's, what neurodiversity really means. But what we do know is that any of those neurodiverse labels that we put on children or medical labels, they all involve trauma, right? So there is some aspect of trauma, whether they experienced it from the stigma that is around their diagnosis or how they're educated. Maybe their symptoms of ADHD are labeled as maladaptive behaviors. Maybe they're considered lazy or unmotivated. So, trauma does just really continue to come up in all of these diagnoses. And we know that trauma rewires the brain. So, we want to make sure that we're creating successful experiences in order for children to grow and, make those new connections from a neuroscience point of view, so that they are able to participate in a productive and successful way. So just some kind of statistics here of 1 in 12 students could not meet the 1984 standards for movement and balance. So if we look at this, and there's a plethora of reasons of why, we can go into screen time and changing the shape of the eyes or posture or just movement in general, access to playgrounds, safe locations. There's just so many kind of areas that I think children are falling far behind in, that is just adding to the difficulty that they're having in school, and it's just presenting with a lot of behaviors. One thing I was really shocked to find is a lot of research talked about children actually falling out of their chairs during the school day. And when I did my presentation, I talked to the educators, and about every single one of those educators agreed that they have students falling out of their chairs. I just found this amazing. The children that I work with, this is not one of the main problems, but it just was, basic sitting skills were so difficult. That was just astonishing to me. So I think, thinking about this from a really basic level is helpful. So if we think about executive functioning, and I'm not going to go into what executive functioning is, but if we look at kind of some of the skills that are needed in school around executive functioning, think about this in the hand model of the brain. So we have the brain stem, which is our wrist, limbic system of our thumb, or the cortex, which is that bumpy part, our fingers. Children listening to a story being read out loud and needing to pay attention. This goes with the cortex. Starting math work when prompted, so initiation of task. Again, another cortex task. Turning in reading comprehension questions with blanks. So being able to self-monitor and go back and check their work. Cortex task. Ability to name the main character of a story. So any sort of working memory. Outdoor recesses canceled due to the weather. So some flexible thinking about what can we do instead of recess requires the cortex. Ability to organize folders, so any sort of organizational tasks, cortex. Math is hard, but we're going to work through it anyway, so that perseverance. Another cortex task. Talking without being called on, right? Being able to raise your hand and wait for someone to call on you, that self-control. And these are one example of many, right, in a classroom. Another cortex task. 5 more minutes to finish your project. Any of those time management skills, transitional skills, all cortex activities. Being able to plan to when no assignments are due, or know how much time you have to put towards a project. Another planning skill of the cortex. So thinking about this, when we're working with kids, we really need that bumpy part, that hand model, to be online working with them. So we have to make sure kids are regulated. So this is kind of where I focus a lot of my OT attention in the school that I work in, and kind of all of the work I do with educators, is that we need kids to be regulated first. And this comes from some sensory strategies that hopefully I'll get into. So every day we ask children to self-regulate. I see so many IEP goals related to self-regulation, and I really don't like it, only because self-regulation is a skill that we learn. It's not something that we just turn 9, 10 years old and are able to self-regulate. We need to learn these skills, and we start learning them at a really young age. So what does this mean? Self-regulation does not mean calm. So a lot of us use the zones of regulation. I want to make sure that we highlight that none of the zones are bad. If we're using zones or not, maybe you don't know them as well. But I typically like to say blue zone is slow, So your body's moving slow, maybe your speech is slow. Green is you're just right. Yellow is you're moving too fast, and red you're out of control. And I like to give kids the example that red does not necessarily mean mad. Red means out of control. So if I won the $1 million in the lottery, I may be out of control. I may be in the red zone, but that doesn't mean that I'm mad. So I think that's kind of a misconception, especially a lot with our ADHD kids, that they don't kind of understand what their slower body means and that it can be a good thing. They always think that they have to be in that fast zone or it's not comfortable. So I really getting them down to green is not always easy. So making sure that they understand that we can have different emotions, we can have different feelings, and that's very different from the behaviors we exhibit from those feelings. So what self-regulation really means is that the energy matches the energy demands of the task. So I would not expect a child who is on the playground to be talking low, moving very slow. They would most likely be in that yellow zone. But when they move back into the classroom, we move into that green zone. So making sure that we're understanding the expectations. And I think for a lot of children, they don't understand those expectations. So the clearer we can make it. I work with one school that they have a really big room that they use for gym, they use for academics, they use for lunch. And what I find is the kids just don't really know how to behave in there because it's used for so many different reasons. So that room does not kind of warrant them to want to be calm and talking in a low voice because they also use it for gym. So just making sure that we're matching kind of the expectations and putting those expectations in a way that the kids can understand. So again, self-regulation skills are learned, and many of the kids that we work with don't have these skills yet, and for a number of reasons. I think we could talk all night about this, but two that I named here, COVID and just their life experiences. So trauma, maybe parenting styles, kind of their own anxiety or mental health. Um, the environment we're just living in nowadays with we're kind of always on the go. There may not be some safe places to play outside. So really just being able to kind of monitor our interactions with others. I think, sorry, I'm losing my thought here, but virtual stuff is great, right? Except we're not always getting kind of the feedback from the other partner. Right now, you guys can't see me. So there's no kind of communication partner kind of back and forth about my facial expressions or my movement. I'm not seeing you guys to kind of see if you're following along with me, if you're bored with the topic. So, all of that stuff we don't really get good from virtual. So I think we're moving in a virtual world and that's difficult for children. Their social skills are changing and evolving. And it's, we have this sense of we get what we want right away. We have Amazon that'll deliver to us immediately. If we want to answer to a question, we can look it up immediately on the internet. We just have this kind of high reward system right now going on that you get it instantly, instant gratification. And, that makes children want instant attention as well. Okay, so for me, I think of kind of this co-regulation as stairs, because many of the children that I work with are at that co-regulation stage, and we're expecting that self-regulation, and we kind of have to work them up through self-regulation. So for a lot of kids, this may look a lot different. It may almost look like we're babying kids. I've heard that a lot, or I've heard that we're kind of giving in. But co-regulation is really us getting on their level, meeting their needs, and working them through the situation successfully. It doesn't mean changing expectations or boundaries. The expectation will still be the same once they're back online. So basically that co-regulation piece is getting their brain back online so that we can talk through some of those cortex level skills. So if we think about interventions in the classroom, I'm not going to go through all of these because, this is stuff that I think a lot of people do know. You can obviously, read it for yourself on the slides, but some of the big ones I think are really validating children. So that connection before you redirect, validate the feelings. It doesn't mean again that expectation has to change. But I work with a great speech and language pathologist, and one of his kind of go-tos is having 3 ways to connect with the child for them to say yes, to get some buy-in. And that may be telling the child, like validating the fact that they're having a bad day or that they're really mad. We tend to want to kind of shy away from that from kids because I think we think that the behavior is going to be worse. But a lot of times when we just validate that behavior or validate that emotion, we tend to send the signal that we're listening, and that children often will even calm down directly from that validation. Um, just meeting the child where they are and allowing choices, and those are child-sized choices. So, what do you want to do first, the math or the science? Obviously, if we start asking those yes or no questions, like, do you want to do your work? Do you want to take the trash out? We're going to get a no, and we kind of have to stick with that because we did ask that question. So making sure we're, asking things like, do you want to take the trash out before or after dinner? So we have a choice there. And there's a little bit of freedom because, again, choices are, for children, it's empowering. They get sometimes a little control in their lives. So being able to make that little bit of choice helps them feel like they do have some control. Having really safe body language, non-threatening movements, safe hands, keeping our kind of level. We want to meet them where we are. There's so many different pictures out there and memes about kind of the two storms meeting and making a bigger storm. So really, if a child is coming with you, say with their, emotional storm, we want to be the calm in that storm, and we want to help them calm their seas. So really meeting them in a safe and kind of neutral way, and hearing them out, validating them. The proximity thing I find is huge too, getting down on the child's level. Again, this is, depending on the situation we're in, could be dangerous. Some of the children that I work with, you do not want to get down and close into them because they will hit you. But, I do find that even with those children, just getting down on their level a little bit more, just shows that I'm there and I'm co-regulating with them. So you're kind of probably wondering, like, how does this really all relate to sensory? Um, and my philosophy is that all learning happens through sensory. So we're always receiving some sort of input from our environment, and that's how we're learning. We're learning through touch that way. We're learning through vision that way. Smells, taste, all of it. We're taking that in on a daily basis, and really all learning in school happens through that. We either see it, we read it, we hear it. So for me, sensory is my philosophy. That's where I start with. So thinking of this as a four-step process, the sensory information comes in, it goes to our brain for processing, it sends messages to the body, and we have a physiological change. Hopefully, we want that adaptive response. We want a good change, right? So we want to, even if it's difficult, work through that process in order to help them create those new neural pathways in order to have a successful experience in the future. So let's talk a little bit about sensory. One of my biggest pet peeves is that sensory is not a fidget. I hear from so many educators, like I gave them a fidget and they threw it across the room, or they are distracted and play with it all the time. Really, fidgets are sensory tools. And when they're not applied to the right sensory needs, they definitely can not work as well. So what is sensory? Sensory is based in neuroscience, right? It's, physiological changes in our body. As an educator, I think it's important to know about sensory because for me, sensory is typically not covered by insurance. Um, Most of us probably know that like sensory processing disorder is not in the DSM. So many kids lack that diagnosis. It typically falls in line with autism, but we don't see many other children with that kind of sensory need um, highlighted in any of their documentation or kind of any plans that are made around their behaviors. And what we do know is that when we pay out of pocket for sensory therapy, it is very expensive. So essentially, where do these kids receive the help they need? And for me, I was finding a lot that a lot of providers were saying, oh, they get OT in school, so sensory will be touched upon in school. And then I go in the school setting, and it's like, no, we don't touch sensory because that's really an outpatient thing. So I was finding that there were a lot of families kind of falling through the cracks here and not getting kind of the help that they need, because in school it's more the function of the student. So can the student write, see the board, access the environment? But we're missing a lot of these things about children being able to sit in their seat and their core posture and all the things that really come down to sensory, their vestibular responses or their bilateral control, all is sensory based. So really looking at all of this and seeing where we can apply sensory. Sorry, this slight delay in my mouse here. So we do know that from the research, teachers that receive consultation for sensory modifications and accommodations see improvement in their students with their reported comfort and safety and enjoyment in being in school. That's one of the biggest things I find is that a lot of students do not like school. They don't feel safe there, they don't feel heard there, and they feel really unsuccessful. So what I did is I created a 6-hour course for educators, and I looked at all of the research related to what's education the teachers had, and kind of applied a true sensory education. So we went through the basics of all of the sensory senses, and we did pre and post tests. We talked about kind of the effectiveness of sensory in the classroom. So this was a 6-hour course broken up into 6 sessions. We did a pre and post test for each. You can see with these sessions, each one kind of had a different topic. And we covered everything from the beginning slides we just went over to executive functioning, sensory integration, looking at all of the systems, and then looking at all of the neurodiverse diagnoses such as ADHD, autism. And really, we did see an improvement in their pre and post test scores. As you can see here, they were clinically significant in each of those sessions. And then over time, we also did how did they feel that this training did it change the way they thought about sensory? And what I found amazing here is that by that sixth session, all 100% of participants did find that they had a difference in their thought about sensory. It was roughly 35 individuals that took this course. Their experience ranged from hardly any time as a teacher to almost 35 years as a teacher. Most of them also did have a lot more behavioral training than research suggested. But I really, really did get a lot of good feedback about it. Teachers felt that the sensory stuff really related to the issues they're seeing in the classroom. They found that it was informative, related to the needs. They really wanted this part of OT and behavior management to be applied to their school much more. They wish that their OT had taken kind of this philosophy in helping with some of the students they work with. They did want more time because this was 6 sessions and they were all about an hour apiece. They really wanted a lot more time to discuss kind of case studies and look into the research more. They loved being able to use the hands-on like model of the hand, and they found it really interesting. And I just, I found this as a really great opportunity for the teachers to think of their students in a very different way. It wasn't to think about the bad behaviors, but it was really to think about those core foundational whys of why is this happening? Why can't this child sit through story time? Or why are they touching everything in the classroom? And we really looked at it from that sensory component. So if I had you guys, as a group kind of talking here, we talk about how many sensory systems there are. I'll throw this out there, but I'll give you the answer anyway. There are 8. So we talk about the 5 that normally we get in elementary school, and then we add on the interoception, vestibular, proprioception. And these are really important, I find, because it's looking a lot at that regulation piece as well. I use proprioception a lot. We'll go through this a little bit. I'm hoping I'm going to speed through the next few slides just so that I can make it in time. But going back to thinking about how all learning happens through sensory, think for a minute about riding a bike. Is there anything that you can think about from riding a bike that is not related to sensory? The direction you're going, how fast you're going, the feel of the seat, the feel of the handlebars, your sense of balance, your use of both sides of the body. This is all sensory related. So for me, I go back to that core sensory. What is lacking? Is there a deficit there? Is there a skill deficit? Is the vestibular system intact? So really looking at all of those different things in order to kind of come up with a treatment plan for these behaviors. So if we think about this pyramid of learning, which I know it's not the complete up-to-date one because interoception is not on there, But for teachers, they want to get to the top of the pyramid. They want to do academic learning on a daily basis. But thinking about a child who maybe has ocular motor deficits, maybe they have their visual system is not working to the best of its ability. And, I find the population that I work with, about 80 to 90% of the kids have ocular motor deficits. So their eyes either don't work in unison, maybe they can't converge. Um, they can't track well. This all plays a role into their learning abilities, their reading and their writing, their copying from the board. So this is for me huge from a sensory component of what is that skill deficit and how can we fix it. So sensory processing, when we talk about this, we're either over responsive, under responsive. Our brain can't interpret the information as well, or we're seeing that motor component involved. Again, I'm going to move through this stuff rather fast just because of the time frame. But I like to talk about the band of optimal performance here. So this is where we are kind of in that just right band, hopefully throughout the day. We ebb and flow. Sometimes we're a little, more regulated and awake. Sometimes it dips down a little, we're up and down all throughout the day, but essentially we can perform well in that band of optimal performance. For sensory kids, I like to think about that bottom line as their threshold. They need the information to actually hit that threshold and come into that band of performance in order for them to be understanding it. And otherwise, we're calling it low registration. If they are, it's going way past that band and we're going into the too much category, those are our over responsive kids. And then, for some of us, we hit that just right stage where, things are just right from our senses point of view, and we can work with it in the optimal band of performance. For me, this really stands out even just as a parent of when my house is so chaotic. And I'm in that too much, right? There's too much noise in my house. The dogs are barking, the kids are screaming, the TV's on too loud. I'm really adjusting kind of my environment to get me back in the optimal band of performance. It may be just shutting off the TV or sending the kids out to play. But that auditory piece, right, getting me back down there is huge for my regulation. So thinking about that for the children that we work with. I also take this and I pair it with kind of the trauma model here. So we know that there are certain kids who've experienced trauma that are either in that hyper aroused phase. So for me, it's much like the too much input of our over responsive kids, or they're in that hypo aroused stage, like our low registration kiddos. So we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing that they're checked out, maybe that they're not engaged, they have their head down on their desk. Maybe they're in that fight or flight and they're running and screaming and hitting, right? So they're in that too much area. But I like to think about both trauma and sensory on the same continuum. I'm going to skip over this one for now. I'm going to skip over kind of these senses, but talking about the auditory, we have so many different, especially in school, we talk about, timers, bells, fire drills. This is all can be very overwhelming for kids in school. It could also impact our ability to follow directions. I find that, a lot of times I'll use rhythm when we talk about any of this, and it'll kind of get the kids back on track auditory wise, especially if I'm having them do an activity. I could try to keep it very rhythmic, and that does help with some of that regulation piece. And then, just to think about trauma and how noisy some of those environments that are involved with trauma can be. Whether it's domestic violence at home, whether it's a car accident, whether it's, any of those minor traumas of, just that overload can be too much. Like I said before, the vision one is a huge one for me because most of the kids that I see have some sort of ocular motor control. We get about 80% of our information coming in from to our sensory systems from the visual system. And I really strongly just want to point out that, we're talking about three different things when we're talking about the vision system. We're talking about acuity, which is how well we see. We're talking about ocular motor, which is how well our eyes move. And we're talking about visual perceptual, which is how well that our brain can interpret that information. And I find that a lot of people are, focusing on that acuity piece, especially when I talk to parents and they say, oh, my daughter went to the eye doctor and they said she can see fine. A lot of it is based on acuity. And from my understanding, a lot of the milestones and the CDC markers are only related to acuity, and we don't have a lot of ocular motor control scheduled screenings for kids, and I think it's a real deficit. But according to that optometry world, they're finding that it shouldn't be a milestone marker. But for the kids that I'm working with, I think if it was a milestone marker, it'd make a huge difference. Okay, so acuity, we're looking at this picture here. Obviously, this is blurry. We can't see it very well. That's very different from our eyes not working well. So, I mean, we can give kids glasses, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to change. It will help for acuity, but it's not going to help for those other visual, perceptual, and ocular motor. There are some, outliers on that, but for the most part, acuity is really that glasses piece. So thinking about kids that can't see letters or faces or images, if they can't read the board, it may impact their social participation. I'm not going to go into kind of all the vision stuff here. This is all part of my much longer 6-hour course. But again, just because we give kids glasses doesn't mean that we can fix their reading difficulties or their visual difficulties. So this is kind of my example for one of the ocular motor control, the examples that I give. So if we look at his nose here, he should be looking at you in one direction. Typically, he looks at you forward. But if you move your eyes to the left or right at all, he should change the direction that he's looking. And this, of course, is just a fun activity. But I like to point this out to teachers, showing that kids with ocular motor control issues may have difficulty seeing images in the same way that we do, especially when they're up at the board, when they're not on copy paper that's clear. For a number of reasons, we can have difficulties with this. So it's just a fun way to look at that. I actually gave this to the teachers and said that, can you tell me what image this is? And when most of them couldn't, I said, well, you're not going to pass this class then. And as an example of that, you navigated your way to your seat, and you drove here. So your vision is fine. So you should be able to see what's here, and you should pass this class. And this was just my example of how we sometimes call out some behaviors, maybe of getting out of their seats to look at things a little closer, or the way that they're kind of interacting with their environment, or maybe even not participating. We kind of give that ultimatum, and we think, well, they have good vision. But this is really not just related to how well you see, but this is related to ocular motor as well. So we obviously have some visual stressors that go on: overhead lighting, glare, poor worksheets, our fonts. So we see a lot of those behaviors: the head down, the refusal to read. They may look distracted, have poor writing, or too lazy, so their writing is messy. So thinking about all of that. The vestibular sense, I really kind of my main points to this is that, my research really just pointed out a lot of the ADHD kiddos and kind of the stuff I took for granted sensory wise. They are a lot like children with autism. And a lot of the children have vestibular concerns related to ADHD. And about 30 to 50% of children related to with ADHD have some sort of motor vestibular difficulty. We do know that vestibular sense can be calming. I'm going to move on quickly through these. Interoception, so how our body feels inside. Obviously, a lot of kids related to this, they just don't understand the signals within their body. So I really think about kind of those little kids who we blame for potty accidents when they really didn't know they had to go until last minute. Those kind of food routines that are disrupted, or poor hygiene, not knowing when to put on a jacket. All of those things we take for granted as behaviors, they may actually not be intentional. So thinking about that a bit more. The sense of smell, this is really a safety factor, brings up some memories, some trauma-based memories as well it could elicit. And it really, just stood out kind of in that autism category, thinking about how the olfactory system is disrupted, and kind of how that could cause many difficulties with social interactions, with especially feeding interactions. So just really thinking about that when we're thinking about the autism population. taste, we thought we had different parts of the tongue that was for taste. We don't. That is a common misconception. My big thing with this is trust. This really stands out to me that I did a example with adults where I fed them the Bean Boozled jelly beans, and then I went to give them something else, and they really didn't trust me. And it really just pointed out the fact that, taste and trust is huge. So thinking about that when we're working with feeding disorders, or any sort of feeding routines that we want to work with these kids, that trust is huge, and thinking about them in a really kind of sense of co-regulation, respect, all of that in order to get through these feeding difficulties. There are studies out there that talk about how early all of this develops, and that babies in 6 weeks, 16 weeks in, can detect amniotic fluid changes. So really thinking about how early some of these develop and how they really build our sensory systems, which will later impact how we interact with the world. Right. I have a bunch more slides, so I do want to move through these rather quickly, but I am lagging. I'm not quite sure why I can't switch slides forward. Oh, there we go. The touch system, for me, this is huge, and it's another one that I took for granted. But this is really related to safety, our interpersonal relationships, developing our body awareness and our motor skills. It provides so much feedback from our other systems and is huge when we talk about feeding. Obviously, when we talk about trauma related to this, I do see a lot of children who have experienced trauma or have been in NICU or have been in foster homes or just really did not have that early, really good bonding, that have a lot of tactile difficulties later in life. Um, it's very interesting. I mean, I think we all know about, how important it is in infancy to have the touch and, kind of that swaddling and that skin to skin time and all of that. But we really do see a big difference in that in children as they get older. Proprioception, so our muscles and joints and how they're interacting with the world. For me, I really think this is a huge calming. I put a star up here because I use this a lot in a lot of my regulation concerns. I use this with vibration. I use this with a lot of pushing and pulling and kind of that big heavy movement. Um, you know, I know deep pressure and proprioception are not identical, but again, going into deep pressure, all of that stuff I find very, very calming. And when we think about it, how do we handle the stressful day? And most of it's going to be related to a proprioceptive way. So, from the answers I've gotten, running, eating, exercising, dancing, walking, hugs, swimming, snuggling in pillows and blankets, and kind of just having that resistance, all of that kind of stuff is really a lot of ways that we as adults have functional ways to handle our stressful days. So incorporating that in the ways we help children regulate is huge. Happens inside of you, we know that it totally rewires our brain. That attachment and authenticity are the two, really big things that come with trauma, and really being able to work through these. And a lot of times they look a lot like sensory to me. So being able to work through them and apply sensory strategies, I think, is huge. And again, I'm skimming over this for the sake of time. But I think a lot about trauma and interoception. If we're not able to kind of know our body's needs, then and we're kind of questioning that, then interoception is a really big skill that we need to incorporate in our trauma work. Um, we talked a lot about this already. There's a lot of studies related to trauma and sensory. So really, again, just the fact that it does rewire the brain. Bruce Perry is great for vibration and kind of talking about how trauma is very rhythmic. I should say in utero is very rhythmic, and trauma responses are huge related to that. Um, I just outlined some things that when we talk about trauma, a lot of times we think about a big event, but it doesn't have to be a big event that happens to someone. It could be smaller events. It could be a medical trauma when the child's younger. So thinking about a lot of different ways that trauma can impact us. I think, we talk a lot about sensory and autism, so I'm not going to go over any of that. What I will say with attention deficit disorder is, again, this is an area where sensory and ADHD should be tied together just as same as autism and sensory. And I just, really want to highlight that because it's huge how the research is showing that children with ADHD have different sensory responses. It happens in about 10% of children, ADHD, which means that there's going to be at least one kid in the classroom typically with ADHD. We know that motor problems happen with children with ADHD. I already went through those statistics. But a lot of times I see kids with ADHD having difficulties in these areas. And there's so much so that some researchers want to consider a new diagnosis called DAMP, which makes motor difficulties a criteria for ADHD. I'm going to skip through this. So as educators, or those working with educators, we can really create hands-on experiences, incorporate strength-based language, help build relationships, improve those social skills, allow choices, movement, of course, looking at any sort of adaptive seating or ways that children can move or kind of interact with their environment. Sensory tools, again, that's not sensory. Sensory tools need to be matched to the sensory foundations, and then using visuals and a lot of that expected language and it's what's expected next. So a lot of that first then stuff, consistency and knowing what's going to happen next is huge. It's such a sense of safety, and that's one of the things with all of these diagnoses and sensory as well, of like knowing that you're safe is kind of key. And we can do that by letting children know what's expected, and what comes next. So my core for how I work with these children is rhythm, deep pressure, vibration, and breathing. Those are kind of my toolbox skills that I use all the time. I will say that I have certain kids that vibration works 100% of the time, and they work for some pretty big behaviors. So I would love to do more research about vibration. I find it fascinating, but I use things like massage guns, vibrating balls, vibrating seat cushions. I think it's really helpful for a lot of regulation. So I have some references here, and I apologize if I sped through a lot of these slides really quickly. I'm going to look to move to the end. So I'm looking for any questions you may have. And those questions can go right in the chat because I believe Anastasia will let me know about them.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Let's see what questions we have.
Sure.
These were not questions. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box. We do have, since it is 7 o'clock already, but more than happy to take a few questions if you guys have them.
Hello, everybody. I was looking for questions in chat too. This is the graduate assistant, Tasha. Audrey, I'd like to just ask a question while we're waiting on other questions, if we have any.
Sure.
I think what stood out to me having a son with ADHD as I was taking notes, one of the things that you said that stood with me was energy matches the energy demands of the task, basically. And, being a mom with a son who has ADHD, and I really can kind of see what you're talking about with some of these, like the lagging skill or the unmet need or the stressor. this is kind of and I know the answer, but I just need to hear it from you. How much does it impact our children? I'm not an educator, but our children, when we are as an adult, as a parent, dysregulated, and then maybe we are leading with things like yelling or like, kind of snatching the kids up to try to get their attention. Could you just give like one example of how a parent who may be dysregulated or even a teacher can take a 2 minute, like what a tool could we use to then allow us to be able to come to the child? Because I think when you're talking about it, when I'm thinking even about teachers, certain times, like when you talk about a lagging skill for a teacher or a parent who doesn't know how to work with that child or that student, they're not getting their needs met by having a child or everybody kind of, focus on the task or whatever the demands that the parent may have. And then it being a stressor where the child is struggling, but now it's causing stress on that person. Can you talk just a little bit about what we can do as a parent or the teacher to kind of regulate ourselves before kind of responding? Because I think it's a twofold thing.
It definitely is. Yeah. I would go back to, my band of optimal performance there and that continuum of like, we all have that optimum performance. And there are times when maybe we are hungry and we're just, we're hangry
Mm,
or, it's just too much or we're moving too fast and we're in overload. And
mm,
obviously we can't co-regulate with someone if we're not regulated. That
right.
whole part of co-regulation is really calming the situation. I do a lot of whispering. If a child is yelling, I whisper. Most of the
Mm,
time, children want to hear what you have to say or what ultimatum or deal you have to make. So, if they're talking really loud, just bringing ourselves down will totally change that whole dynamic.
mm,
And that's where I see a lot of adults thinking that some of that co-regulation piece looks a lot more like playing games or teasing a child or kind of, distraction, if you will, of we don't have to stay on the topic that's keeping them escalated that moment,
mm.
because they're not going to hear us when they're escalated.
Okay.
So, doing some sort of incompatible behavior of like, if they're screaming, let's see if they'll sing with us and get them back. When we're doing those kind of things, we're assessing how they're responding to us. Are they following along? Are they listening to us? Are they calming down? Are they, we want to just get them calm in that moment.
Okay.
And sometimes that looks very different than how people expect us to respond, which looks a lot more punitive.
Okay.
Um, so there's no way that we can regulate someone if we're not regulated ourselves.
Mhm,
That's huge.
mhm,
And I think that's true for adult to adult, so
mhm,
spouses and arguments there.
mhm,
You have to have two people to argue.
mhm.
So really just coming in there with that co-regulation, with that regulated adult and being able to navigate that situation.
Okay. Thank you. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Right. I'm just going to take a few questions. Somebody said, thank you for the recording. Will it be available to us? Yes, it is. How can we take the 6-hour course?
So I have on my website, I do have a sign up for the 6-hour course. Currently, there's one that I think I may be canceling next week, but I'm going to be offering it again at another date. So you can definitely contact me directly. And there'll be some future dates coming out, but my website, that getagripoccupationnaltherapy.com, has the sign up for that.
My goodness, there's
I
quite a few
also do present those at
questions.
some schools. So if you do have an organization or a larger group that wants me to come out and present it, that is an option too, and we can discuss that if you contact me.
There's quite a few questions, so what I could do is send it to you,
Sure.
and maybe we can respond. But can you please list again the vibratory tools to use, rhythmical tools? We are going to be sending out the presentation as a follow-up,
Yep.
so you could always take a look at that. Can there be a part 2 course to talk about the strategies that you could use or that you suggest to educators?
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely open for the training, any sort of trainings. So whether that comes through Bay Path or a training I could offer, I'd be definitely, I'd be open to proposing that.
Can the current OT research on sensory modulation carry over to the geriatric population? Within the past year, sensory integration has been introduced in skilled nursing or post-acute settings for older adults with memory dementia or cognitive impairment. Any recommendations on how to introduce caregivers or family educators on sensory needs of adults?
Very good question, and that's great to hear. I think, for me, sensory, I had always kind of thought of it as this kind of, I don't even really know how to describe it, but I just, thought it was something that we did. But really, I find that everything is sensory. All learning is sensory. Life is sensory. So really just, I think it's great that we apply it to the older model as well. And I think, teaching families and caregivers about it is great. And, even from a strategy point of view. And I think, for, those interested to really take continuing education courses on sensory, I went back to the University of Chan and got my sensory certificate. But, really understanding some different, modes of sensory and understanding how, smell is so immediate. So using smells and things like that can be, have immediate reactions and not need to go through certain parts of the brain and be processed in certain ways. And I think all of that can definitely help when we look at kind of that long-term care model and kind of how we set up environments and how we keep like those dementia profiles to look similar to what a satisfactory sensory environment looks to those individuals, right? So, if we have certain smells in the house or certain ways we hold our hair or things like that, I think are so important to, how our body remembers. So when we are kind of losing that that mental capacity to keep our body in a kind of a good sensory realm, if you will, I think is extremely important.
All right, one more question. Do you have suggestions on how to handle classroom when the majority of the students are struggling with the regulating or doing the tasks that are expected? When it is a daily occurrence, how do we help those students?
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, that can be very hard. And I think, the situation, it's kind of not a universal strategy. So it really has to be what works for the team and kind of what works for that environment. But sometimes it does mean we take a step back and we make things super easy and super accessible for those kids. So they start feeling some consistency, some gratification in what they're doing. Um, when we're struggling, all of us, I think this is true for any of us of like, if we have way too much going on in our environments, in our life, sometimes we need just to take a step back and things to be easy for a moment so we can regather ourselves. And I think a lot of times we go back to saying these kids can handle it. They need stronger, more punitive expectations. And I don't always think that's the way. So that out of box thinking of meeting them where they are at that minute. And if it means, we shut off the lights and we have a couple minutes of quiet time, or we get up and we move and we do activities movement based. I think thinking outside of the box is huge for that. And when we start to see the differences, when kids start to see kind of what they expected to happen and that kind of pushback and that power struggle to happen, and when it doesn't, I think we start interrupting some of that dynamic.
All right, and then the rest of the questions, I do see them, so we'll be able to get, actually.
Yeah, if you want to even send them to me via email and I can email back if it's.
There might be one more. The rest are actually just thanking you for the great presentation, which is fantastic. Can you talk about the sensory system and did it, where did it go? I lost the question. Okay, never mind.
Okay.
All right, so just a little bit, at Bay Path, we do have 4 different OT related programs. One of them is our MOT program. It is a full-time on-campus program that is completed in 2 years. So it's technically considered our accelerated program. We do have an MOT bridge program that's designed for OTAs and PTAs. There's 2 different tracks essentially. So, and the time frame is either 3 or 4 years. We do also have an MOT part-time hybrid option. It kind of run the same similar way as the bridge program, and that's a 3-year option. And then lastly, we do have our post-professional OTD program. This program is 100% online, can be completed in about 5 to 8 terms. And we do have a option for people who have a bachelor's in OT who want to pursue their OTD. So if that is something that you're interested in, please let us know. I do recruit for the post-professional OTD program, and then Julia recruits for our master's in OT. Here's the contact information to all of the important people: our program director, Dr. Julie Watson, myself for the OTD admissions, our presenter, the director, Tracy Bentley-Root, for the MOT program. Julia does our admissions for OT programs, and then graduate assistant for the OTD program, Tasha. So if you have any questions specific to any of us, please reach out. We'll be more than happy to assist. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Dr. Vantangoli for being here tonight, presenting an incredible presentation. Obviously, you captured everyone's attention, which is what we always want. So for questions, please refer to the contact provided. And we really appreciate you joining us tonight. And then the recording and the slides will be shared with you in the next couple of days. So please keep an eye out for future events, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much.
Anastasia, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that there were questions. They didn't come up for me. And so I had just asked a question because I didn't see them on my particular webinar. I'm not sure why, or maybe that you just have them.
Yeah, I did. So not a problem at all.
Okay.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.